Alright, you guys, Sinner Alcaraz, number 11. Let's run it back. It has been long overdue, and as you guys probably have heard by now, first meeting in a big final. And yeah, even though Jannik Sinner only became the guy we know him as now in late 2023, it is surprising to hear that stat that, they've only been in two finals before this, 250 in Umag and then 500 in Beijing last year. Obviously, the two have played, in other very big stages. They've played at 3 of the 4 slams at this point already. But of course, all of them being on the same half of the draw. And yeah, it was about time after 2024 really marked the true changing of the guard. And these two being the guys to beat on the ATP Tour. Given that, of course, we had the Beijing final, which was definitely probably their best match since the initial signs of promise in this rivalry in 2022 with their Wimbledon, and especially, the US Open match they played showed what was to come. And short of their first big final taking place in a slam, I think Rome is as phenomenal a backdrop as you could ask for. Obviously, you got one of the most beautiful venues in tennis, impassioned crowds, even more so with the comeback of Jannik Sinner onto the tour this week, and just all types of great history at this event. It does feel to me like over the years, this more than any other of the clay court masters, with Monte Carlo being the quick turnaround from Sunshine Double hard courts and a non-mandatory masters at that, as well as Madrid, an outlier in conditions of clay courts. This is the event where it seems like, because of those factors, both those events often see some omissions, guys electing not to play, and everybody reconvenes at Rome and really seems to up their intensity that close ahead of the big one at Roland Garros. As a result, obviously, within the Big Four era, we saw all types of, classic epic matches take place at this event. So it's only fitting that they get to host another banger, marquee final between the game's two brightest stars. And, how lucky are we that this is a match that already so quickly into Jannik Sinner's comeback is one that we can feasibly get behind, expectations of it having the potential to be special. Of course, Jannik having not played anything this year after the Australian Open on account of that settlement suspension between him and WADA to bring a close to his whole doping case. All eyes were on him, and of course he's been drawing raucous crowds all week long for all of his matches. But everybody, had eyes on how he would come out on the other end of this. And I guess as far as mentally his response to playing through all the noise and turmoil to come out of, this whole doping case of his since last August, we saw him close the year in 2024 on arguably an even bigger tear than what he was on to start the year. Cincinnati on, of course, goes on to lose just the one match to Carlos Alcaraz in the Beijing final, picked it up in Australia. Looks like more of the same, and after the latest hiatus, you did expect a little bit of rust in Sinner immediately coming back, and I wouldn't say that hasn't been the case. I think that certainly showed up throughout his run here in Rome, but that's just by the standards of the world's best player. At the end of the day, he is in another big final at the loss of just one set along the way against, not a cakewalk path. I mean, straight from his first match, Mariano Navone knows what he's doing on the clay, and of course his third match, Fran Cerundolo's probably having a career year to this point, and he was very much entrenched in that match with Jannik. he really made Sinner come up clutch in that one. I think between that match and the Tommy Paul semi, it was great to see that, despite the 3 months off, Sinner has not lost that winning aura about him at all. There's really no shakiness in the pressure moments, really safe for maybe a handful of moments where he looked a little bit more vulnerable in closing situations, but all things considered, I mean, when you're not playing matches, no matter how much you're practicing, there's no way to simulate, those situational instances, and Sinner, it's like he never left, and even though the Paul semi was obviously a drop-off coming back down to earth from, a God mode match from the quarterfinals for Jannik with Casper Ruud, where, I'll say, having watched most of that match, I think that's the best match anybody played on clay this year. I think that's definitely the single best match Sinner has ever played on clay. But despite, Casper Ruud's track record on clay, of course, coming off winning his first big title in Madrid, all this pedigree of doing great at the French Open, great at Rome, I do feel, against guys up a weight class and in that tier 1, Casper definitely can be a guy that plays them into rhythm. And that's certainly what ended up happening between, Sinner and him. This isn't the first time. It just seems like Ruud is a very comfortable opponent for Jannik. And, in this particular match, it felt extremely Djokovician, which, that has been the callback for Sinner. And it does feel like him more than anybody else, most resembles a high-level Djokovic clone in many ways, where, it's just suffocating from the baseline. And in Casper's case that night, it just felt like anything that was regulation, balls that would be neutral balls against, 99% of the tour, it felt like he was toast the moment he hit any of those. And he did try to go more high risk in the second set in particular, but it really just didn't matter what he was trying. Obviously, the scoreline reflects that. Tommy Paul in the semis, a little bit of the antithesis. Not really a rhythm player, unconventional ground strokes, and in that particular match, their semifinal, he was definitely upping the ante, the aggression on his forehand in particular. Obviously, we've always known this is a guy that can move with the best of them, and, he's only growing more comfortable on clay. A second consecutive Rome semifinal. And on the Sinner side of things, it was good to see that he was able to problem solve on the fly like that, take a punch in the mouth, recover and steady the tide from a substandard start to the match for him as well. And by the end, despite some people raising an eyebrow about, him looking a little bit weary, jaded, potentially maybe even having some niggles in the hamstring, him being able to bring it home and, again, being able to come through these 4 or 5 opponents, for the most part, pretty convincingly, even without it being the apex Sinner for a lot of it, that's just ominous. Even for the short term, in all likelihood, this just means that he's only going to continue to get better by Roland Garros. And with the way that Rome has gone for him, to so quickly get back to this final, as I said, have that aura around him return that, when the chips are down, there's no difference. There's no change in who he was 3 months ago, while also, having access to, having played at that apex level like he did for the one match in the quarters against Ruud. It's certainly a bolster in confidence for Jannik, ominous for the rest of the tour. And yeah, even despite if he ends up just playing Rome, which I believe he's slated to play Hamburg next week as well. I don't know if he will, considering how well it's gone so quickly for him in Rome. Of course, in addition to the quick turnaround to Hamburg and then Hamburg to Roland Garros. That all remains to be seen, but regardless, if Sinner stays healthy in these next couple of weeks, you definitely like him to have his best French Open. And I know last year when he came in with similarly, not very many matches to go off of, and actually, even more physical trouble leading into the French Open. He kind of breezed his way to the semifinals. Obviously a set away from making the final, losing to Carlos Alcaraz in 5. That was not the apex for either of them, really. Both had their physical struggles throughout clay court season last year and really, truncated what their lead up should have been. But this time around, Sinner, he'll have more quality reps for sure, and with the 3 months off, he should be fresh. Of course, in that time as well, seems to have put on a little bit of muscle. That'll do him well as well. There is a lot already that is a win for Sinner in these 2 weeks in the Italian capital. In many ways, it's already a win of a tournament for him, regardless of how tomorrow goes. But let's turn our attention to his counterpart, Mr. Carlos Alcaraz, the man this year's clay court season. As much as it may not feel like it, the kid is in the midst of a rather dominant European clay court season between a win in Monte Carlo, a final in Barcelona, and at the very least, a final in Rome. What's interesting this year is that historically, albeit it's not much to go by still, even though it feels like Alcaraz has been around so long for being so good so early, he is a newly minted 22-year-old who this year really was getting his second shake at both Monte Carlo and Rome. Previously, since becoming a top player, he had only played Monte Carlo in 2022, losing early there in his first match to Sebastian Corda. Same thing with Rome a year later, 2023. He loses in one of the bigger upsets in recent times with Fabian Marozsan just blitzing him in his opener in 2023. But how impressive is it that on the second time of asking, he wins Monte Carlo, and he is at least going to get the chance to contest for the Rome title to do the same thing at the second time of asking. And by doing so, I think he has rightfully earned being considered the favorite heading to Roland Garros this year. And to be honest, looking at the macro, I find myself in a pretty weird place with Alcaraz because I don't think his form necessarily inspires the type of confidence in you that it would for a guy that his results on paper are Monte Carlo winner, Barcelona final, potentially Rome winner, but at least finalist. The runaway best player this European clay court season. A bounce back, at least to get back to winning ways that was, felt very much needed. Felt like order was restored after a somewhat disappointing beginning of the year, and in particular disappointing Sunshine double for him. And that's why I'm not particularly bothered by the fact that I don't think his form is necessarily something extraordinary right now. Because you look through really his entire year, but even if we just hone in on this clay court season, there were a handful of really, really good matches at the back end of Barcelona against Gerard de Minaur and Arthur Fils in particular. I think the Fils match, the semi in Barcelona, was probably Alcaraz's best showing of the year. That as far as level, I would say probably his best overall win was the Draper win this week in Rome, where, he did really well there to avoid that match really getting into the trenches, which it could have. Draper had several opportunities to do so, and Alcaraz did really well to batten down those hatches, shut off Draper's way back into the match. Even if it was streakier but, he was really good throughout portions of that match as well, level-wise. But otherwise, it has been a lot of scratchy tennis, which is not something you would associate with a guy putting up the results that he has. And again, it's weird, because that brings me to this paradox. It's sort of contradictory, where I've definitely seen him play a lot better. This is not his apex, and he's not playing particularly extraordinarily. But I've also never been as impressed, where, my thoughts on this kid have been documented for the last 3-4 years, and I've gone from Indian Wells, misleading me into thinking hard courts were going to be his best surface, when in reality it has been his clear worst to this point. And while I don't think yet it's clear-cut between clay and grass, we know he excels on both of the natural surfaces, but what I have come to the conclusion of is that I am pretty confident saying now that I think that his floor is easily the highest on a clay court. And there's a lot of components to that, because, obviously it's a pretty much predetermined notion that you have to move great. If you're somebody whose physicality is tremendous, you will benefit on clay. And yes, those are both true. But also a big part of what people miss on clay is that it really does emphasize point construction. And if you think it just values grinders, I would think again, because it really is those guys with point finishing capabilities and somebody with the power of Alcaraz that, at will, whether it be with touch or with just the sheer power, has the ability to impose their say on point finishing. Those guys are going to benefit from the clay even more, and it is married with, in Alcaraz's case, probably the, at this point, best conditioned, all-around physical specimen that the tour has to offer. So when you put that all together, I think it is no coincidence that a lot of the times over the last couple of years with Alcaraz on clay, you see his opponents, even the ones that stick with him for 2-3 sets, I've seen a lot of opponents physically break down, run out of gas. Zverev last year, one of the most well-conditioned guys on tour, and the last 2 sets were 6-1, 6-2 with him in the French Open final. Musetti obviously was a very physical run to the Monte Carlo final, but he too saw his body pretty much quit on him a little over a set in with Alcaraz on clay. And so even if Carlos plays as patchy as he has, I would probably say most of this clay court season, there is all of that to fall back on. And even if he puts multiple feet wrong in a match, even if it seems like he's making things harder on himself, best believe everything is still taking its toll on the opponent. And that's why, even as somebody that enjoys his tennis, I have found it frustrating watching him this entire season, because I know what he is capable of. And like I touched on before, except from a select few matches at Indian Wells and Barcelona this year, I don't think he's really met the bar of playing clean all that often this year, especially in his biggest matches. I just don't think we've seen the apex in ways that we did. Obviously, 22, particularly 23. A lot of people lament that in watching him these days, and, even said so about 2024. But, say what you will about that. I still think, he touched that apex, at Indian Wells, portions of Wimbledon, portions of the Olympics for sure, Beijing, Laver Cup for what that's worth. I don't think he's touched it this year, at least not in his meaningful matches. And all year, I've kind of had the question in the back of my mind. I don't know what the impact of more weight in the racket was. For all I know, it's contrary to what I'm going off of, which was when Nadal added the lead tape to his racket in 2012. It was for more power. If it's for the same thing, I do question if that was the right call because, Alcaraz has had the up and down roller coaster nature of his game his entire career to this point, but I've never seen it fluctuate so wildly as I have this year, where for the first time I feel like, the longer a rally goes with him, I feel like a miss is right around the corner. The misses this year to me just look more wild than they have in the past. Maybe that's just confirmation bias. I don't know. But that's just been the feel I've gotten. But all that is to say, considering all of that and him still winning, I don't think that's an accident. And it certainly goes beyond just winning ugly. As bad as it can look at times, he still very seldom takes the really bad loss. And on clay, that's even more rare than everywhere else. And I think that just comes down to, does he still have the ability to access his peaks, even if for just a stretch within a match? And that answer is still absolutely yes. And if that's the case, just the physical specimen that he is on this surface, chances are he's going to break you down, and he can do it to just about everybody on tour, especially now as Djokovic, who has gotten him the last couple of times on clay, it becomes more of a bigger if we get a well-playing Novak Djokovic and he gets older. But on this surface, on a clay court, he has demonstrated physical superiority to just about everybody, no matter who you are. And so that brings us to Sunday's final, which, leaving it on that note of the physical exertions it takes to hang and beat this guy on a clay court, I think that is hugely to his benefit heading into this final. The physicality aspect is the one part of Jannik Sinner that is not yet proven, because it's the one place we still haven't really found out how far Sinner has come, because, how are we supposed to find out when you're just blowing guys out left and right? But I'll tell you what, all three of their matches deciding sets. Of anybody on tour, it is probably going to be him that will test the limits of Sinner's conditioning and fitness, and I'm just willing to bet, for this reason more than any other, that, this early in a comeback, Jannik Sinner, his conditioning is not all the way at 100% right now. And it wouldn't really even have taken me seeing that third set against Paul. I don't really even buy in that heavily into, people, the commentators in particular, that were raising an eyebrow in the third set to, is he hurt or something like that. I think most of that is just down to the way Sinner walks and kind of moves like a grandpa between points with this little old man giddy. But he seemed at least alright to me. And, even if that had been, super straightforward at the end, I still would say that Alcaraz, even with both of them at 100%, has the definite physicality edge. And I think that's even more pronounced now, because you're really upping the ante in the caliber of opposition, really for both guys. But, just in Sinner's case, since he's coming off a long break, I think it's more of an unknown for how well he holds up, both in the fact that he probably won't be the guy dictating as often as he's been through all his other matches this Rome run. The defense very likely will be tested more than it has been, and so will the endurance part. I really think that for Sinner to win, he would, ironically enough, have to get back to what he was doing in this matchup before he was a better player, when he held the head-to-head advantage, I think, through 2022, 2023. it looked like a lot of the same, where, it was just barraging Alcaraz, robbing him of time, and making him press, which is something he's capable of doing. I mean, being the best ball striker in the world by some distance, it goes a long way in affording you the luxury of that being an option, but it is also clay, so that just makes it even harder. But, not doing that, trying to outsteady Alcaraz, I think is a way to win the battle, not the war, because, the way Alcaraz has, fluctuated again, those down periods, definitely, we will see him, get behind in the score against Sinner for those stretches. But if you also see the Alcaraz peaks as we have, then that will afford him the ability to push this the distance, which is big advantage Carlos, I think, in these conditions. And that's why my prediction is something resembling that. I think that it will be a 3-setter. Especially because relative to their capabilities, I actually do think Sinner has been a tad bit better, which I think, assures us a competitive match. I mean, neither of these guys really get routined all that often at all, but I also don't think it's that much of a better form advantage, where Alcaraz wouldn't be able to get his with the forehand and really impose himself and really make this a battle of attrition where you would back him. So that's my prediction. I think Alcaraz in 3. And obviously we should be in for a treat regardless of outcome, as it always is when these two play. Quickly has become one of those rivalries where every time they do play, you sense the weight of the occasion, and all eyes in the tennis world are watching. So we should be in for a good one. You knew I couldn't pass up not talking about this one. But that'll do it for this video. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, it would be much appreciated if you take a couple seconds to subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and also drop a like on this video. Help this video perform better in YouTube's algorithm. But thank you all again so much for watching. I appreciate you, and of course, I will see you all in the next one.